Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the latest example of a school Ofsted inspection resulting in the death of a teacher, and discuss how the unsuitability of the inspection process, which undergoes massive changes every few years for no readily apparent reason, but never actually improves, consistently results in damage to the teaching profession. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So during my teaching career, Ofsted has too often seemed a barrier to progress in teaching. There has been progress made in many areas, but instead of driving that process, Ofsted has often seemed to be the barrier to it. Not the inspections. The inspections are fine, or I have always thought so. And of course, you need an inspection system. Where the problems occur are in the ever-changing and never consistent approach that Ofsted takes in even understanding what it's trying to achieve through its inspections. When I first became a teacher, the head of Ofsted was someone who said that teachers who have sex with their students shouldn't necessarily be sacked. He said there was educational value in it. I kid you not. I have to say, the teaching profession and the government have thought otherwise. Indeed, the Labour government of the time tightened up the laws for teachers. But the fact that he could say something like that as the head of Ofsted and remain the head of Ofsted for another year was quite something for a young teacher like myself. Now, we've got an Ofsted inspector now who has never even been a teacher. And if the watchdog itself cannot appoint suitable people to lead it, how on earth can it be an appropriate body to do its job and drive up standards in teaching? And what its job is, it's not to simply let the government and public know how schools and colleges are doing. It is to allow schools and colleges the freedom to be able to improve things and be recognised for that. And yet it does none of these things. How can people who either lack any experience in education or have attitudes that are completely at odds with what either teachers or parents would want, how can they do that? We already have inexperienced incompetence in charge of teaching. We call them the education secretary. We don't need their close advisors to be ignorant as well. We understand that secretaries of state are fairly ignorant. Some of them may be intelligent and wise. That's the best we can hope for. But we know they are. Some of them may come from a background that's related to their department, but that's generally not the case. We understand that. That is democracy. But we need their close advisors to absolutely understand the industry. I mean, for a start, how are we going to make sure that all Ofsted inspectors are suitably competent if the head of the organisation is not suitably competent? If they've never been involved in teaching, how can they make appointments that will get the right people in? And how can people who are completely at odds with the teaching profession possibly design an inspection framework which enhances the quality of teaching? If you cannot recognise good or bad teaching, how do you do that? It's not possible. If you don't get the right leader, you will not get the right people under them. You will not get the whole industry pulling together in the right direction. I will say that my personal experience of Ofsted inspections has always been fine. That is to say, when I've had classroom inspections, I've never felt unfairly treated by any inspector. But that's just the classroom inspections. That's just one part of the process. Obviously, the main bones of contentions, they're not the inspections or even what's written about the inspections. It's the grading by and large. The latest tragedy is that a head teacher has killed herself as a result of Ofsted. And it was Ofsted. Because you think to yourself, were Ofsted really at fault? Or were there other factors at play which were not the fault of inspectors? With the deaths which have occurred in teaching as a result of inspections, you could say, well, sometimes one, sometimes the other. Sometimes I'm sure no fault needs to be ascribed to the inspectors. But in this latest case, I have to say, as a former teacher, they were more than a little responsible for this death. The way they conducted the inspection may have been fine, but the report was so bad that it borders on negligence. Ofsted have got 4 grades. 1 is outstanding all the way down to 4, which is really quite bad. You need remedial action here. 2 is what you mostly aim for. 2's good. 2, they go away and leave you alone. Ofsted use these grades on various aspects of how the school operates, and then there's an overall grade. Now, for a start, I think grades are lazy. The reason we have them is so you've got a quantitative measure. Oh, people like quantitative measures. Ministers like quantitative measures, but it's lazy. In this latest case, the report graded all aspects of the school as good. So they got the number 2 rating for all of it. Oh, brilliant. Good school. Cracking. But they graded the leadership as 4. This is beyond brainless. You know, I've often had gripes in the past where I've seen Ofsted reports. Sometimes I've been working at a place that's had an Ofsted report where they've graded the leadership as higher than the rest of the school or college. And you go, well, what? How are you judging leadership? You judge leadership surely by the outcomes of that leadership. Well, if Ofsted grade a load of outcomes as one particular grade, how can they grade the leadership higher than that? What are they basing it on other than a subjective view of boxes ticked? There is a case, I can think of one case where maybe you judge leadership as better than the general outcomes. So let's say a school has a history of failing. It's doing really badly. And as is often the case in such schools, a new leadership team is appointed. Okay. And then you have an Ofsted inspection soon after that. And the inspection takes place and the leaders haven't been in place long enough. And they say, well, look, we like what they're doing. We think that there's promise here. But they haven't had time to achieve the outcome. So we will grade the leadership as higher than the overall school. I can get that. But the reverse can't really be true. It's putting the cart before the horse. How can you say the leadership is bad, but the outcomes are good? Leadership has to come first. Leadership first, outcomes come as a result of that leadership. So unless you had a well-performing school that suddenly hired Mr. Bean to lead it, but in the real world, if a school is achieving good outcomes, how can you possibly grade the leadership as being catastrophic? Not just a bit lower. Absolute bottom, needs remedial action. Is the school somehow managing itself well despite terrible leaders? That's nonsense. You know, it was a subjective judgment made because of some prejudice that the lead inspector had. No other explanation. It was related apparently to one little incident they saw. In fact, I don't think leadership should be grading Ofsted reports at all because I don't think it's valuable. I don't actually think the grading is valuable at all. I think the report, if anyone's interested in how their local school is performing, they will read the report. The report's not that long. Read the report. You then get an overall view. You can make your own judgment. You don't need the grades. I think there should be comments. I think there should be a report written up. And I think people should then take it or leave it. The grade is meaningless. If the school is achieving good outcomes, and not all of the outcomes are purely academic, by the way, safeguarding, value added, inclusivity, all important elements. But if the school is achieving good outcomes, the leadership has to be good. If it's achieving outstanding outcomes, the leadership has to be outstanding. Only if it is not achieving outcomes can you ever say that the leadership is lacking. But these are problems that have always existed at Ofsted in all the times I've been teaching. Every few years, they have a big reset. I mean, I've been through all this as well. You know, you get trained, for the next inspection, Ofsted are looking for this. And it's completely different to what they were looking for a few years ago. And it's like, how can what they're looking for be completely different a few years later? They have this big reset about how inspections are going to work every few years, which is a sign itself that they really don't know what they're doing. Because a child has 11 years of compulsory education. Within that 11 years of compulsory education, Ofsted will have changed its mind 3 or 4 times about what is good and what is bad teaching. So the problems persist because there's this disconnect between what the government claims Ofsted in for and what they really want Ofsted for. You know, they claim it's to monitor and drive standards, but in reality, education secretaries use Ofsted in order to drive their own personal ideas. But as almost no education secretary has ever had any experience in education, their ideas rarely make sense. Education policy in the UK is sometimes a bit like Brexit. There's plenty of ideology behind it. Nothing really in terms of a researched plan. But there's another problem these days as well. So Ofsted are essentially monitoring outcomes. And who decides what these outcomes should look like? The government. Fine. Only this is the same government which has consistently underfunded education since coming to power. Teachers, especially senior teachers, are currently under increased stress as they try to achieve already challenging outcomes without the budget to pay for the basic materials, upkeep of the buildings, heating sometimes in winter, and more recently, even staff. You imagine the pressure that head teachers are under with a budget that cannot possibly meet the requirements for even a basic level of service, much less that which is needed to achieve these lofty outcomes. Because while the Tories have been reducing the funding, they've not been lowering the bar for standards. They still expect the high standards without the money to resource it. So you consider the huge stress that various teachers are under as they're asked to do 5 impossible things before breakfast, to deliver with fewer and fewer resources, while suffering real terms pay cuts themselves and for their staff over an extended period. How their own professional development falls by the wayside as their dwindling resources are just about keeping their heads above water. For example, first half of my career when Labour in power, I and colleagues were sent on training several times a year for upskilling. We'd learn new skills several times a year. There was a budget for it. All came to an end in 2010. Second half of my teaching career under the Tories, didn't happen. The only training I had was the usual annual in-house training where, people would come in and train us on things like safeguarding, but that was all free. That didn't cost. That didn't come out of a budget. But the actual, upskilling training disappeared. You might have a few teachers in the school or college who'd be able to afford to do that, but it wasn't routine. Before it used to be everyone was expected to do some. Also, the number of contact hours teachers have, it's 25% more than when I was a young teacher. So that's 25% increased workload just in terms of that, if there were no other pressures as well. That means less time to prepare for more hours being taught, for less money in real terms. Just imagine the extra stress that all this creates. And then imagine what happens when some cretin comes in, tells you that your school seems to be using resources really well. You're getting really good outcomes. Oh, this is great. This is good. This is good. This is good. Oh, it's all good. But you're rubbish. Because you didn't tick a box of mine. So you're rubbish. This is partly why teachers are leaving the profession in unsustainable numbers. And it's why teachers are suffering poor mental health, which in some cases ends up resulting in death as a result of an unfit for purpose inspection system or other unsuitable interventions or lack of interventions like funding. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.